Hello and welcome back to your migration unit 3 this time as we move through your AQA history revision. In our last unit we were looking at unit 2, so we looked an awful lot about Britain looking west, so Britain getting involved in the Americas, starting the slave trade or playing an active part in that slave trade up until 1833, as well as looking at other groups like the Huguenots, the Ulster plantations and the Highland clearances. Migration Unit 3 that we are going to look at today is a very dense unit. There's a lot going on in this one, but I would say whereas Unit 2 can usually be categorised by America and looking west, I would say that Unit 3 is going to be mainly about India. So most of your examples from this unit may include India, although it also includes Africa because the Scramble for Africa fits in to this time period. So let's have a look through it then. We're going to start off, as we said, with India and look at the East India Company. So India is one of the biggest countries in the world. It's got a population of 1.3 billion people today, and compare that to the 66 million or so people in Britain. You can see on our map on the top right just the scale between the two different countries. Yet Britain ends up controlling India and makes it a key part of their empire for many centuries. So India was very rich in natural resources like gold, silver, copper and iron, but it also had resources that were particularly valuable in the 18th century, like spices and tea. So as we know from our last unit, Europeans have started to expand out of Europe, and so we saw that they went to the Americas in 1492 with Christopher Columbus, but since 1497 Europeans had been travelling to India. When they arrived from the 16th century onwards, they set up these huge warehouses called trading stations where they store the goods that they are going to trade, that they have got from India, that they can trade either back home or around the world. And all of the British trading stations are run by one company, and you can see their badge on the right hand side, their slogan and their logo. It is the East India Company, who were founded in 1600. And it is impossible for us to imagine quite how powerful the EIC were. At one point they are responsible for over half of the world's trade, and as we will see, they are going to play a huge part in taking over the vast majority of India. So in 1757, the Battle of Plassey happened, and that is a really key battle for understanding this topic, because that is when the small 3,000 troops of the East India Company defeated 40,000 Indians. And the reason why they did it is because the company wanted to have easy trade across regions of India, and if ever there was trouble in regions, they would use their private army to put that trouble down, because nothing could stand in the way of them making huge amounts of profit. So they take over this very lucrative region of India called the Bengal region, and then over the next sort of 60 years, by 1818, they had control over most of India. And in 1773, within that time, the EIC does a deal with the British government. They have economic problems of their own, so the British government agrees to rule India jointly with the company. So it's a shared venture, a shared exercise between the East India Company and the British government. And as a result of Britain controlling an area like India, we see some real moments of fight back and of controversy. So I've called this the Indian Mutiny because that's what many of you will have studied in most of your textbooks, but it is more commonly now called the Indian Rebellion, because the mutiny sounds like it's not justified in some way, or maybe it's not. It makes it sound like it's not a particularly big deal. But the Indian Mutiny or the Indian Rebellion was in 1857, and that was where the Indian soldiers, known as sepoys, refused to use the new rifles that you can see pictured on the top right. They were Enfield rifles, but the cartridges where the bullets were kept were coated in beef and pork fat in order to make them sort of pass through easily through the machine. Now, because soldiers had to open the cartridges with their mouths, that went against their religious beliefs, because Hindus can't have beef and Muslims can't have pork. So this caused a huge rebellion where the sepoys were refusing to follow the British orders, led by a man called Mangal Pandey, who was the first to refuse to use the rifles. They set fire to towns, and at the Cawnpore massacre, 200 British women and children were killed as a protest against this decision by the British Army. After the rebellion, Britain punished the Indians severely. The Muslim soldiers were sewn into pigskins before they were hanged as like a final insult to them. Some sepoys were strapped to British cannons, as you can see on the right hand side there, and fired through, a horrible way to go. And the British government felt that they could no longer trust the East India Company, so they took complete control of India after the Indian Rebellion. Queen Victoria appointed a viceroy, somebody who was going to rule India on her behalf, but Britain did start to allow more Indians to gain jobs in local government. So, a key event for us to know about, and as always, I've put some key factors that it fits into, so religion, war, government, things like that. I won't mention them every time, but do pay attention to those, because that means you can use that information in your factors question 4. So how was Britain impacted by India and vice versa? So India became the jewel in the crown of the British Empire once America has become independent in 1776. It was seen as the thing that Britain was most proud of as part of its huge empire, sort of spanning a quarter of the world at one point. And Britain set up new industries like coal mining, they built factories, they built over 30,000 kilometres of railways, and if you ever get a chance to visit India, then you will see that the railway system is extensive. They set up vaccine programs to fight diseases. They introduced a developed legal system and sort of taught the ideas of British democracy. However, it's important to hold all those improvements in your head on one side, but also maybe remember that many of those improvements, if not all of them, were done to make more money for Britain. They weren't necessarily done because of a love and a care for the Indian people. And some of their actions, of the British actions, really show that. So I've put on the top right, you've got a picture of the Bengal famine, where millions of Indians in that region died in part because the British forced Indian farmers to grow produce that could be sold in Britain. And as a result, they ended up not having enough food that could feed people in the region. And it's such a controversial moment for Churchill, who we talked about in our last unit, is seen as possibly the greatest ever Briton and was voted that in 2002. But he, as leader, chose not to, is criticised for not sending sort of additional food over to help the people of Bengal, even though Britain was a key part of the British Empire at that time. Britain was also influenced by India, and as we know, India helped make Britain incredibly wealthy. 140 million is our best estimate for how much Indian exports were worth to Britain in the early 1900s. India also influenced British culture. So you've got a picture on the right hand side of the Brighton Pavilion, clearly using sort of Indian architectural styles, and some of our language as well. So if you pay with cash, or if you use shampoo or wear pyjamas, all of those words are in our vocabulary now, but come from Indian, come from the Hindi language, I believe. So that's a story of India, which is a key part of this unit, but Africa is also a massive one, a massive part of Unit 3. And a lot of that is to do with the man on the top right, whose name is Cecil Rhodes. Cecil Rhodes was an imperialist, an empire builder, and he believed in the idea of social Darwinism. Now, social Darwinism is a racist belief that Africans are less evolved or were less evolved than white Europeans. And as a result, Cecil Rhodes believed that it was white Europeans, it was their job and it was their duty to rule those areas on behalf of the Africans. So this idea led to the Scramble for Africa, which we will see in a moment. Rhodes took control of northern and southern Rhodesia, which we now call Zambia and Zimbabwe, and he's a very complex character. He stopped black people from voting, he increased taxes, but on the flip side, there were people who point to his scholarships that he offered for black students to go to different universities, particularly Oxford University in England, where there was a statue of him up until very recently. So he is somebody who is debated about whether he was a force for good in any way, or whether his influence on Africa, particularly Zambia and Zimbabwe, were very damaging. We mentioned the Scramble for Africa before, and our map is really helpful on the right hand side. In the 30 years from 1870 to 1900, Africa was colonised. 90% of Africa was taken over. And a big part of that was because they were motivated by Africa's rich natural resources. We've seen Britain travel over, particularly for gold, ivory and diamonds. But the other reason for that is partly religious. So Christian missionaries sometimes referred to Africa as the Dark Continent because it was seen as being tribal religion was much more important and they had not accepted Christianity. In this period of the Scramble for Africa, Britain took over 16 countries, including Nigeria, Kenya and Egypt. So all of those places begin to form this British Empire. Egypt I want to talk about particularly. In Egypt, Britain had already bought a controlling share of the Suez Canal. The Suez Canal, it was in the news relatively recently because a large container ship got stuck in it and stopped loads of trade. But the Suez Canal is really important because it allows countries to trade around, particularly for Britain to get to India without having to go, on our map on the right hand side, you don't have to go all the way around the bottom of Africa in order to get to sort of the Middle East and to Asia. So the Suez Canal, if you are able to control that, then you are able to trade much easier. So the Prime Minister at the time, Benjamin Disraeli, he paid £4 million for control of the canal, and it was called the Key to India because it allowed Britain to travel directly there. And then because it was so important to Britain, when Egyptians rioted against British interference, the British simply seized control of Egypt. So it's another sign, a bit like the Battle of Plassey, that if Britain feels like if they are making money and they are worried about the impact of fighting and of violence in an area, then they will just go in and take control of that region because they cannot afford to not make the money. Another key part of this unit, and again looking at Africa, is the Boer War. So the Boer War, we're going to focus on the second Boer War for our studies, 1899 to 1902, and that's conflict between the British Army and the Boer people. So they're white farmers of Dutch descent, but who live in southern Africa, and at this point had lived there for sort of 200 years. When diamonds were discovered in Boer states, Britain sent troops to seize control of those areas, even though they were run and controlled by the Boers. The Boers were a small group compared to the British. They did not have the economic power to provide lots of sort of expensive weaponry, but they fought incredibly bravely. And it was only the British introduction of a scorched earth policy, we call it, where they burnt Boer land to the ground, down to the ground. They killed animals, they poisoned water supplies, that led the Boer to finally surrender. The British also introduced concentration camps. With 20, and you can see a picture of one of those concentration camps in our top right, 28,000 dying, many of whom were children, and this is one of our first examples that we see of concentration camps in history. And so if you are asked a significance question for the Boer War, in the short term you could talk about the impacts of on the Boer people, of the scorched earth policy and all of those things being destroyed, but in the long term you could talk about the creation of concentration camps, which we know would be put to devastating effect in the 1930s and 40s by Adolf Hitler and the Nazis. Another thing that's really significant about the Boer War, which is why I think it would be a great one to come up in your paper, is that the Boer War had an unintended consequence. Not only did 22,000 British soldiers die, but when the British government were trying to call soldiers up, they had to reject a third of the men who tried to join the army. And the reason they had to be rejected was because they weren't healthy enough. They were classed as unfit for duty because of poor diet or because they had illness or disease. This was a wake-up call for the government of the time, and so they introduced the liberal reforms. They're called liberal because that was the party who was in charge at the time. And they were like, we need to make British people healthier. So they introduced things like the free school meals campaign, unemployment benefits, and old age pensions. And all of that comes from fighting on the other side of the world in the Boer War. Two more to go. We've got Irish migration here, sparked off by the Irish potato famine. So in 1846, a blight, which is a disease on potatoes, which affected large parts of Europe, but it hit Ireland particularly badly, and there were 1 million deaths. You can see what the blight would have looked like on the right-hand side. It hit Ireland particularly hard for two reasons. One, Ireland was a country that was very dependent on the potato as part of their diet. But the second one was that Britain was in charge of Ireland at that time, and a lot of the landowners were classed as absentee landlords. They owned the land, but they weren't there. So they did not allow Irish people to farm on their land, either because they were using it to grow crops that they could sell, or they were just keeping it, for selfish reasons. And as a result, that land meant that they could not grow any other crops that could feed the Irish people. So in this time period, 1.5 million Irish people left, and many of them went to Britain. Another reason why lots of Irish people migrated was to become navvies. So as you can see on the bottom right picture, they were becoming navvies, which would mean building canals, roads and railways. And on arrival, Irish people were persecuted, one for being Catholic, but they were also, as many groups of migrants are, they were blamed for doing things like taking jobs or bringing diseases or causing crime. And whenever we hear about groups of migrants, they are usually the 2 or 3 things that they are criticised and blamed for, and have been since the start of migration to Britain, sort of thousands of years ago. 10% of British people today have Irish parents or grandparents, so they have had a huge impact on our country. And areas of high Irish migration, like Liverpool and Birmingham, anthropologists, people who study human beings, think it's one of the key reasons why those areas have very distinct accents, because of the Irish influence of those areas. So places like Liverpool and Birmingham have very different, distinct accents, perhaps traced back to Irish roots. And you could list loads and loads of famous British people of Irish descent. I've put C.S. Lewis and Ernest Shackleton on there, but if I was being less highbrow, I could mention the footballer Wayne Rooney, England's second top goal scorer of all time, at my time of recording. Final one then is Jewish migration. So in 1881, Jews were incorrectly blamed for the murder of Russian Emperor Tsar Alexander II. And so as a result of that, attacks on Jewish people began to start across Europe, particularly in Russia and Eastern Europe. Those attacks on Jewish people were called pogroms. And as a result of those attacks, 120,000 Jews arrived in Britain between 1881 and 1914. And then 80,000 more arrived with the rise of Nazism, as Adolf Hitler began to persecute Jews and bring in laws that firstly threatened their sort of independence, but then as the war and his rule progressed, they began to threaten the mere existence of any Jewish people. If you wanted to talk about impact of Jewish people, a really great example to include would be Michael Marks. So Michael Marks was a Jewish businessman who teamed up with Tom Spencer and created what we know as the great high street giant Marks and Spencer. There are loads of other notable British Jewish people you could mention, particular ones here. Lord Sugar, who is obviously leads The Apprentice on BBC. Actor Daniel Radcliffe, who plays Harry Potter in the popular films. So that is Unit 3 for us. Let's have a look at some practice questions before we finish. You could look at a significance question. Question 2, explain the significance of the Battle of Plassey. An 8-mark question. Again, think about short term and long term. In the short term, you could talk about the fact that it means that East India Company is now incredibly powerful. It shows that they now control the region of Bengal, stuff like that. In the long term, you could talk about the fact that it's the start of British rule in India, and think about the years that India doesn't become independent until 1947. So think about the fact that all of that starts with the Battle of Plassey. You could mention the Indian Mutiny as part of that. You could mention the huge amounts of profit that Britain makes, and that all comes back to the Battle of Plassey. Or you could think about, or you could do both, but question 4, your big factors question, has religion been the main reason for migration to and from Britain? So you could maybe think about the Scramble for Africa, people migrating from Britain to Africa in order to build up the empire, because they believe that Africa is the dark continent, so going as missionaries to try and change that. As always, try and come up with 3 different time frames in your 3 different factors. So it would be great to give a couple of examples for each factor, and then see if you can spread them out across the different units. Okay, I hope that has been useful for you, and we'll be back very, very soon with our Unit 4 video. Okay, best of luck. Bye-bye.